Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class, a production of iHeartRadio.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Tracy V. Wilson.
And I'm Holly Fry.
This is part 2 of our accidental two-parter on chemist Sir Humphry Davy. In part 1, we talked about how he became medical superintendent at the Pneumatic Institute and did a bunch of experiments involving nitrous oxide and then wrote a 580-page book about it. He was only 19 when he got that job. He did not have a lot of formal education. When I started envisioning this episode, I sort of thought that was going to be the episode. But he also had a whole career after that point, and that is what we are talking about today.
So last time, our discussion of Humphry Davy's work was mainly about gases, and specifically nitrous oxide, but that's not the only thing that he was working on. He published his first paper in the Royal Society's Philosophical Transactions in 1801. And that paper was on the voltaic pile, an early electrical battery invented by Alessandro Volta. In a voltaic pile, alternating disks of two different metals, such as copper and zinc, are stacked together, along with fabric disks that are soaked in something like salt water or vinegar. Initially, it was believed that the current in a voltaic pile was caused by the voltage difference between the two alternating metals. Davy's paper argued, correctly, that it was really the result of a chemical reaction.
In March of 1801, Davy was offered a position at the Royal Institution, which had been founded in 1799 to teach the general public about science. He was assistant lecturer in chemistry, director of the laboratory, and assistant editor of the institution's journals. In addition to his salary, this position came with a room, coal, and candles.
So charming. We have discussed about how most of Davy's education was self-directed, and this was not all that unusual for someone of his social class, especially in a field like chemistry, which was basically brand new. This was also the age of the so-called gentleman scientist, although there were also women like Mary Anning and Caroline Herschel. A lot of scientists pursued their work independently, often without any kind of backing from a formal institution or a lot of formal education, and the field had not been professionalized. But even in that context, Davy's appointment to this position was pretty remarkable. It wasn't just that he didn't have formal education in chemistry. He didn't have much formal education at all, and he was only 22, already well-published when he was offered this position.
His work with nitrous oxide didn't entirely end when he left the Pneumatic Institute. On June 20th, 1801, he gave a public lecture at the Royal Institution. This lecture was on respiration, and he told the audience that anybody who wanted to could experience this gas afterward. In the words of a 1930 write-up on Davy in Science Progress in the 20th Century, quote, "The spectators were amused by the antics of the experimenters, and one subject at least enjoyed paradise, for Mr. Underwood was so transported and so reluctant to leave heaven for earth that the breathing bag had to be snatched forcibly from him."
As a side note, the Pneumatic Institute didn't keep its focus on gases as a curative forever. In 1804, it became the Preventive Medical Institution for the Sick and Drooping Poor, which, as its name suggests, was a hospital for the poor, focused primarily on the treatment of tuberculosis. Its founder, Thomas Beddoes, died 4 years later.
Some of Davy's other lectures at the Royal Institution were on tanning. He tried to figure out how tanning worked at a chemical level. I'm talking about the tanning of animal hides, not going out for a suntan. So he was figuring out how that worked and whether there were improvements that could be made to the process. He concluded that workers at England's best tanneries had already developed pretty good methods for their work, so he didn't try to come in and revolutionize the whole process. But he did look for substitutes for some of the more expensive and harder to source materials that were used in tanning. In particular, he found a substitute for oak bark, which was in short supply. But that substitute was catechu, which was an extract from acacia trees, which grew in India. So, of course, that gets into a whole tangle of British imperialism and colonialism.
He also worked in agriculture, including testing the quality of the soil and developing recommendations for different types of fertilizer. This followed the same basic pattern as his tannery work. He was figuring out the chemical processes involved and making recommendations for adjustments when necessary. But generally, he thought what Britain's farmers were already doing was working pretty well, and he did not try to totally re-envision things. He published Elements of Agricultural Chemistry based on this work in 1813.
Davy also gave lots of public lectures on chemistry more generally, and soon he was really in high demand as both a speaker and a dinner guest. He was charismatic and used a lot of showmanship in his lectures, and he tended to attract a lot of women in the audience and around town. There are some sort of comedic illustrations of him doing lecturing in which, like, the audience is overwhelmingly women. There are also stories about him working in his lab until the absolute last second and then putting a clean shirt on top of what he already had on as he walked out the door to go to some dinner engagement.
Davy became a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1804, and he was awarded the Society's Copley Medal in 1805. The Copley Medal is an award for outstanding achievement. It is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, scientific awards in the world. In 1807, Davy was elected as one of 2 secretaries of the Royal Society, and he was also awarded the Napoleon Prize from the Institut de France. Although England and France were at war, and a naval blockade meant that there was no way for him to even be informed that he had won this prize.
That's going to come up again later, though. Also in 1807, Davy started working on isolating and identifying different elements using electrolysis. This was connected to his earlier work with the voltaic pile. He had concluded that if a chemical reaction could generate an electrical current, then you could maybe basically do the opposite. An electrical current could also be used to initiate a chemical reaction. So he used electricity to isolate pure sodium from caustic soda and potassium from caustic potash. Apparently, he wanted the word potassium to start with PT, like the word pterodactyl, but a transcriber misspelled it in the first manuscript on the subject as that was being prepared, and this, like, incorrect in Davy's mind spelling stuck.
Let's just go with this.
Yeah. Also, a lot of these elements are, like, very reactive when they are isolated on their own, so this probably involves some very dramatic moments in the lab. Davy isolated more elements in 1808, including boron from boric acid and calcium, which that process involved electrolyzing lime and mercuric oxide together.
By this point, Humphry was incredibly well respected, and he was influential as a scientist. He was also trying to put his work into use out in the world. At one point, he visited Newgate Prison to evaluate its ventilation system, and while there, he contracted typhus, also known as jail fever.
In 1810, some of Davy's work focused on acidity. We mentioned back in part 1 that Antoine Laurent Lavoisier had believed that oxygen was present in all acids, and he had coined the name for oxygen based on that idea. At the time, hydrochloric acid was known as muriatic acid, which is a term some people still use today. Lavoisier had believed that removing the hydrogen from muriatic acid resulted in oxymuriatic acid and that contained oxygen. But Davy concluded that this did not contain oxygen and that, in fact, it was not a compound at all. Instead, he said this was its own element, chlorine, which he named for its green color. Davy didn't actually discover chlorine. That's usually attributed to Carl Wilhelm Scheele in 1774, but Davy was the one who determined that it was an element.
Davy was awarded an honorary doctorate from Trinity College, Dublin in 1811. On April 8th, 1812, he was knighted, and 3 days after that, he married Jane Aprice, who he had proposed to about a month before. She was a wealthy widow and a socialite and an intellectual, sometimes described as a blue stocking, and she had hosted her own salon. Jane had inherited money from her late husband and from her father, who was a merchant whose business had been primarily out of Antigua, where he dealt in both goods and enslaved people.
Also in 1812, Davy published a book titled Elements of Chemical Philosophy, which was dedicated to his wife. And that same year, he was injured in a lab accident while working with nitrogen trichloride, which is highly explosive. While he was recovering from this accident, he needed an assistant, especially to help with things like record keeping. So he hired 21-year-old Michael Faraday. Faraday continued working with Davy for years. Sometimes his role was more like a valet or a personal secretary, which he seems to have found pretty degrading. Sometimes he was more like a lab assistant or an apprentice.
Davy recovered from his injuries in 1813, and that year he also left his position at the Royal Institution. Thanks to his marriage, he no longer needed the job. But in spite of their common intellectual ground, Humphry and Jane don't seem to have been very well matched. There was just a lot of friction between the two of them and a lot of public bickering in the later years of their marriage. Sometimes they spent long stretches of time apart, each of them pursuing their own interests.
But they also did travel together at some points, including taking a trip to France in October of 1813 to collect that medal that Davy had been awarded back in 1807. This is a weird trip. England and France were still at war with each other. The Davys apparently made this trip along with Michael Faraday with Napoleon's permission. But even with that permission, they were still arrested and detained after they got to France. Once they were released, they went to Paris. They met Napoleon's second wife, Marie-Louise. They did not meet Napoleon himself.
Davy seems to have butted heads with a lot of people on this trip, making no secret about his antipathy for the French. This was about politics and the ongoing wars between England and France, and it was also about science. We have already talked about his criticisms of some of the work of French chemist Antoine Laurent Lavoisier. He also had a huge rivalry with French chemist and physicist Joseph-Louis Gay-Lussac, with the two of them arguing over who should get credit for the identification of iodine as an element, which was connected to the work Davy carried out while in Paris. Bernard Courtois had first described iodine in 1811, and then in 1813, Gay-Lussac and Davy had written work identifying it as an element about a week apart.
This is a trip where I was like, hey, friend, you didn't have to go to France, a
And
place
bicker with everyone.
that you were angry at and your nation was at war with.
He wanted that award.
Some of the descriptions of it just make him sound like a big jerk to me. After leaving France, the party went on to Italy. Eventually, as we know, Napoleon was forced to abdicate as Emperor of the French, and he was exiled to Elba. The party decided they should go back to Britain after they heard of Napoleon's return from exile in 1815.
After returning to Britain, Davy was asked to work on the problem of coal mine explosions. And we're going to talk about that after we pause for a sponsor break.
Humphry Davy was living at a time when demand for coal was skyrocketing in Britain and in other parts of the world due to the Industrial Revolution. In the mid-18th century, Britain had been producing about 5 million tons of coal per year. By the mid-19th century, that number had increased more than tenfold as railroads and factories burned coal to drive steam engines. Miners had to work faster and dig deeper, and that made a job that was already difficult and dirty increasingly unsafe in the face of mine collapses and explosions of flammable gas, which at the time were known as fire damp.
One of Britain's worst mine explosions happened on May 25th, 1812, at the Felling Colliery. This was an enormous explosion that was heard for miles, and it killed 92 men and boys who had been working in the mine. When crews attempted to reopen the mine, it took days for the flammable gases inside to become diluted enough for anyone to try to enter. The Society for Preventing Accidents in Mines was established the following year, and they contacted Humphry Davy for help.
Davy's first step was to collect samples of gas from the mine and analyze them. And he concluded that fire damp was primarily methane. This was not a new discovery. Other researchers had already said this is methane, but he confirmed that earlier work. And then he started experimenting with it, collecting it and testing it in things like jars and tubes and other vessels to figure out exactly in which conditions it would explode. He eventually concluded that fire damp only exploded when exposed to very high temperatures, which is not really surprising, but the methods to light the mines involved an open flame, so this meant that the risk of explosion was just constant.
So, to solve this problem, he set out to create a safer lamp. And Davy's first design enclosed the flame in a glass chimney with tubes to allow air into the lantern and exhaust out of it. This limited the amount of methane that could come into contact with the flame, and it also gave the gases time to cool as they moved into and out of the tubes. It wasn't possible for large amounts of methane to move through these tubes, so exposure to fire damp could cause the flame to burn a bit brighter, but not explode. And the outside of the lamp did not get hot enough to cause anything to ignite.
Soon, Davy modified this design, replacing the glass chimney with a mesh screen after determining exactly how fine the mesh had to be to prevent explosions. While it was possible for methane to make its way through this screen and burn inside of the lamp, that flame could not pass outside of the screen and cause an explosion. This lamp could also help miners detect whether there were buildups of dangerous gases in the area based on the height and the color of the flame.
Davy started publishing papers on this research within a couple of weeks of starting work in 1815. And by 1816, lamps he had made were being successfully tested in mines. When a friend said that he should patent his invention, he said, quote, "I never thought of such a thing. My sole object was to serve the cause of humanity. And if I have succeeded, I am amply rewarded in the gratifying reflection of having done so. More wealth could not increase either my fame or my happiness. It might undoubtedly enable me to put 4 horses to my carriage, but what would it avail me to have it said that Sir Humphry drives his carriage and 4? I love that. In March of 1817, Davy was thanked for his service to miners at a general meeting of mine owners that was held in Newcastle. He was also awarded the Royal Society's Rumford Medal and made a baronet.
But Humphry Davy was not the only person to develop a miner's safety lamp around this time. George Stephenson, collier engineer at Killingworth Colliery in Northumberland, had also developed a safety lamp pretty much by trial and error. This lamp was known as the Geordie, and it was popular in the area near where he lived. Like Davy's initial design, it used a long glass chimney as well as a series of tubes to allow air in to fuel the flame. The chimney was also protected by a metal tube that had holes through it.
Stevenson contended that Davy had stolen his design, while Davy called Stevenson a pirate and a thief, so that went great. Eventually, a committee was convened in Newcastle in November of 1817, with Royal Society President Joseph Banks presiding. They cleared Davy of all suspicion of having stolen the design of the lamp, but to be clear, these were also Davy's friends and scientific associates.
Yeah, and Stevenson was not regarded as a scientist. He was a mine engineer. A third contender for the inventor of the miner's safety lamp was William Reed Clanny, doctor from Ireland. Davy had examined one of Clanny's lamps in October of 1815, so this lamp definitely existed before any of Davy's were being tested in the mines. But Clanny's lamp was also a lot different from Davy's or Stevenson's. It was airtight, and the air was supplied to the interior of the lamp through bellows. This meant that using this lamp required the mine to hire a boy to pump the bellows while the lamp was being used.
All 3 of these designs were in use in different parts of Britain and Ireland in the early 19th century, with different designs being popular in different regions. But they did not totally eliminate mine explosions. Each type of lamp worked as long as it was used correctly and as long as it was in good repair, but there was a lot that could go wrong. The designs that used glass chimneys meant that those chimneys were breakable, so if a lamp was dropped and broken, flammable gas around it could still explode. The wire mesh used in Davy's lamp could also corrode over time, leaving holes large enough for flames to pass through. Sometimes miners opened the cover or bypassed the safety to do something like light a pipe, and some didn't want to use them at all because they were more cumbersome and unwieldy than other light sources.
Davy's refusal to patent his lamp, which we read earlier, makes him sound pretty noble, but he was also vocally critical of these other two lamps and the men who had developed them, and he was really self-righteous when it came to his descriptions of his own work. He was really angry about the fact that there were people who thought the other lamps were better or that he did not deserve any credit for the one that he had developed. I read a paper that argued that, according to his behavior in this whole incident, he was a narcissist. Some of Davy's critics on this, though, were also very vocal. There were people who favored the Stevenson or Clanny lamps, who called Davy's lamp the murder lamp.
Oh, bless him. It just sounds like a lot of people mad that they're not getting lauded. Davy went on another trip to Europe after finishing his work on a miner's safety lamp. And while there, he tried and failed to find a way to unroll and read a scroll that had been retrieved from Herculaneum.
This also involved chemistry. He didn't just try to open it up, but the fact that this came up recently on Unearthed.
I know. How excited would he be to see the stuff that people have developed today?
He might be mad. In 1818, Mary Shelley published her book, Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus. And in this book, Professor Waldman is a chemist who delivers a lecture that's attended by Victor Frankenstein. And this chemist inspires Victor Frankenstein's later work. Sometimes Humphry Davy is cited as an inspiration for this character, while other people cite a similarity to various other British scientists from the early 19th century. Mary Shelley definitely went to some of Davy's lectures, and of course, she was also influenced by the work of the Romantic poets like Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who we talked about in part 1, who were part of Davy's social circle.
Yeah, they had a lot of, the Venn diagram of their social groups has a lot
Very
of
interconnected.
overlap. Humphry Davy's career as a chemist had been groundbreaking and influential, but that is not the note that he went out on, and we'll talk about that after a sponsor break.
In 1820, Joseph Banks, president of the Royal Society, died. Banks had been president of the Royal Society for 42 years. His interim successor was William Hyde Wollaston, who served until an election could be held, and then Humphry Davy was elected in November of 1820.
Davy's tenure as president of the Royal Society really did not go well. Under Banks's 4+ decades of leadership, the Royal Society had become part social club for gentlemen and part scientific institution. Some of its members were Banks's personal friends, who didn't necessarily have any interest or aptitude in science. Davy wanted to reform the Royal Society into a bona fide scientific institution, and of course, that raised the ire of people who liked it the way it was. Divisions developed between the people who wanted reform and the ones who wanted to keep things the way they were, the way that Banks had done it.
Yeah, this is also connected to the whole process of professionalizing and formalizing scientific fields. His presidency also threw a wrench into his relationship with Michael Faraday. Faraday had worked with Davy for 8 years at this point, and he'd gone from basically being Davy's scribe and assistant to a respected scientist in his own right. He could no longer be described as anything like an apprentice, and he didn't need Davy's supervision. But the Royal Society also had its own internal politics that Faraday kind of ran afoul of. Like, William Hyde Wollaston was doing a lot of work with electromagnetism, and he seemed to think that Faraday's work on the same subject was horning in on his own territory. And then Faraday felt like Davy did not give him enough support in this dispute.
Things became even more contentious when Faraday did an experiment that produced liquefied chlorine. It was an experiment that Davy had suggested he do, but producing liquid chlorine was not part of the expected outcome. Davy thought Faraday should have credited him when he reported the results of this experiment, but Faraday did not.
Then, in 1823, Faraday applied to be a Fellow of the Royal Society. So, taken on his own, this probably would not have been very controversial. Like we said, he had developed his own reputation by this point. But there had been so much nepotism in the Royal Society under Joseph Banks. Davy felt like if he supported Faraday's application, it would look like he was just doing the same thing. So he told Faraday to withdraw his application. Faraday refused and ultimately did become a Royal Society Fellow. A number of sources that I read when I was working on this episode characterized Davy's behavior here as really arrogant and petty and suggest that he was suffering from kind of an overinflated ego after his earlier years of such tremendous success.
My first thought is, okay, just recuse yourself from that process, dude. This
seems
is
like there
not
were,
hard.
I don't know what the bylaws were like, but it does seem like there would have been other options.
Yeah. Davy also had some setbacks in his professional work. In 1823, he was asked to find a solution for the corrosion that was degrading the copper sheeting used on the hulls of warships. This was part of an effort to scale back on naval spending, since at that point, Britain wasn't at war with another maritime power. Britain was at war with the Ashanti Empire, but that did not involve ships beyond transporting troops to what is now Ghana. Davy's solution was based on the idea of cathodic protection. Soldering another type of metal to the copper gave it a negative electrical charge, which stopped the corrosion. And after testing this in a lab, Davy had Faraday try this on 3 ships in a dockyard, and that seemed to work.
However, it turned out that the copper was what had been keeping barnacles and other sea life from adhering to the hulls. And this solution prevented that from happening. It had been sort of leaching stuff into the water that was keeping the barnacles from making their homes on the hull of the ship. So instead of hulls that were covered in corroded copper that needed to be replaced, the hulls were instead covered in copper that was covered in barnacles, and eventually enough barnacles would affect the ship's performance. This is another moment that some sources interpret as coming from arrogance, because those miners' lamps had worked in the field the same as they had in the lab. And Davy seems to have just assumed that the same would be true of the ship protectors.
In 1824, Davy founded the Athenaeum Club along with Secretary of the Admiralty John Wilson, in part to try to cut down on some of the divisions that were plaguing the Royal Society by giving people who had ties to the Admiralty another outlet. Davy served as the club's first chair, and Faraday was its first secretary. 2 years later, Davy and Stamford Raffles founded the Zoological Society of London, which helped set the stage for the establishment of the London Zoo.
In September of 1826, Davy's mother died, and he attributed some of his own increasing health problems to her passing. He was reelected as president of the Royal Society in November of that year, but at that point he was obviously unwell. A month later, he had a stroke at the age of 48. While his father also died at a really young age, there is some speculation that Davy's years of self-experimentation may have been a factor in this early shift in his health.
Humphrey's brother John took him to Italy to try to recover. And although his condition did improve, he wrote to his wife and to Davies Gilbert to say he planned to resign as president of the Royal Society. He did resign on November 6, 1827, and he was replaced by Davies Gilbert. He also worked on a book on fishing called Salmonia, or Days of Fly Fishing.
Humphry asked his wife to come join him in Italy, but she couldn't, so he returned to England for a time before heading back to the continent. This time, accompanied by a medical student named James Tobin. It occurs to me I should have looked up whether Tobin was related to his godfather. I don't actually know. maybe Tobin took dictation for another book of Davy's, and that was a set of memoirs and dialogues called Consolations in Travel, or The Last Days of a Philosopher, and that was published posthumously.
Humphry had another stroke in February of 1829, and his wife and brother were sent for. Humphry Davy died on May 28, 1829, at the age of 50 in Geneva, Switzerland. He had a fear of being buried alive, and he had asked for his burial to be delayed to make sure he really was deceased. But the laws in Geneva did not allow for that to happen. He was buried in Geneva, and his wife Jane later had a memorial tablet placed in Westminster Abbey.
Davy had been incredibly well-known and well-respected during his lifetime. I mean, we talked about him discovering a bunch of different elements and inventing the miner's safety lamp, although there were other people who did the same. But he was soon really overshadowed by Michael Faraday. Sometimes Faraday is described as Davy's greatest discovery. As a side note, when Faraday was offered the presidency of the Royal Society on 2 different occasions, he said, "No thanks." There is some presumption that his experience watching Davy go through that made him like, I don't want any part of that.
Hard pass. Also, in 2008, after the Royal Society of Chemistry asked for help in finding the medal that had been awarded to him by the French, family members reported that at some point after Humphrey's death, Jane threw that French medal right into the sea.
He said that it brought up bad memories.
He didn't like France. Let's get rid of it. That was the worst trip of our lives.
Yeah. Anyway, Humphry Davy is kind of a journey. That's where I have landed after all of this. We'll talk about him some more on Friday and the behind the scenes. I have an email from Phil. Phil wrote and said, I just listened to your show on etiquette. It took me back to memories of my childhood. We had a family friend that was a socialite. We would often see her picture in the society section of the paper. She was often attending the best events throughout town, charities and other big events. She would often try to teach us proper etiquette. I have a feeling she wasn't sure we were getting proper education in these areas from our parents. I grew up in a family of 4 boys, so she gave us a gift one year. The gift was a book published in 1969. Stand up, shake hands, and say, how do you do? I remember looking through it as a kid, but the sections on attending someone's debutante ball, not sure if that's what they were called in the book, seemed so foreign to me. A few years ago, we were cleaning out my mom's stuff after she died. My brothers and I had a great weekend of telling stories as we went through all of the items and divided them. We came across this book. My brothers are all a few years older than I am. They told stories about how strange the book was to them when they got it, and the only thing they really used it for was to learn how to tie a tie. I felt better about my thoughts about the book because that was the only thing I used it for as well. My dad moved out of our house when I was about 9, so I didn't have dad around to teach me that. I always thought the book was a little pretentious and stuffy for our lifestyle, but it brought back great memories of our dear family friend. One of my brothers has the book at his house, so I can't refer back to it or confirm exactly what is in the book. Your podcast stirred that memory for me. Thanks for your show. I am including a picture of Willow, our Saint Shepherd. She is a goofy dog, but we love her, Phil. Thank you so much, Phil, for this email. I love this whole story.
I do too. I think that's a great use for that book. It gave you one life skill. That's all you need out of a book for it to be valuable.
Yeah. It also reminds me a little bit of my spouse, who's not the youngest, but is also one of 4 boys who lost his dad at a young age. So also raised by a mom. And now I'm like, did they have any etiquette books to try to teach them things at their house? Most of the stories I hear about their growing up involve my spouse being put into dangerous situations by his older brother.
Oh, yeah.
Also, Willow is such a sweet looking dog.
I mean,
and is
cuteness.
Standing in some snow.
Cuteness. Cuteness beyond all reckoning.
Yes. So thank you so much, Phil, for this email. If you'd like to send us a note, we're at historypodcast@iHeartRadio.com. And you can subscribe to the show wherever you like to get podcasts, including the iHeartRadio app, any number of other podcast apps. And on Friday, we'll talk about our own behind-the-scenes thoughts on this episode. Stuff You Missed in History Class is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.